Welcome to Old Lantern Tales, where every story holds a secret, shadows, mysteries, and whispers from the past, all waiting for you. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The First Knock. The fog that night did not drift through the street. It coiled low against the stones as though reluctant to leave, clinging to the iron railings and swallowing the glow of the gas lamps until the world beyond the widow's narrow house seemed erased, and inside, where the air smelled faintly of camphor and extinguished candles, the only sound was the tired ticking of the grandfather clock inching toward 3:17, each second dragging with a weight that pressed against the lungs, and Hastings stood, too near the door, though he pretended not to notice it, his eyes fixed instead on the carpet as if the pattern there required deep study. Yet his fingers betrayed him, twitching at his side, and when I asked him quietly what troubled him, he answered without lifting his head, "It does not miss the minute," as though speaking of a train schedule rather than something that had left 7 men cold beneath white sheets. And before I could inquire further, the first knock came, not loud, not violent, but measured, deliberate, 3 raps spaced so precisely that the silence between them felt engineered, each pause identical to the last, as though silence itself had been disciplined into obedience. And Hastings inhaled sharply, too sharply, while across the room the widow's lips parted but no sound emerged, her gaze fixed on the clock face where the long hand crept toward its appointed mark, and I approached the door slowly, noting not fear but calculation in the air, because what unsettled me was not the presence of the sound. It was its composure, its refusal to hurry, and when the third knock faded, the clock struck 3:17 with a hollow chime that seemed to vibrate beneath the floorboards, and in that same breath the doctor, who only moments earlier had been assuring us that Mr. Harrow's heart was fragile long before tonight, staggered backward, one hand clawing at his collar as if the air had thickened into rope, and he collapsed without drama, without cry, as though something invisible had simply concluded a task, and the widow did not scream. She merely closed her eyes, whispering, "It is done," and that frightened me more than any hysteria could have, because it implied familiarity. And when Hastings turned to me, his face drained of color, he murmured, 7, and I corrected him softly. No, this would make 8, though in truth I had not yet verified the count, and that detail unsettled me deeply, for how had my mind reached that number so quickly? And as the doctor lay still, the silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, stretching thin across the walls, until suddenly 3 more raps echoed, not from the door this time, but from somewhere within the room itself, dull and intimate, as though knuckles had pressed against the inside of the walls searching for exit, and Hastings spun toward the fireplace, swearing it had come from the chimney breast. Yet when I placed my palm against the plaster it was cold and unmoving, untouched by vibration, and still the echo lingered in the bones more than the ears, and the widow rose slowly from her chair, her shawl slipping from her shoulders unnoticed, and said with dreadful calm, "Each night it moves closer," and I studied her carefully then, not her fear, but her certainty, because certainty is rarely born from imagination, and the clock resumed its ordinary ticking as though nothing at all had occurred, though one man lay motionless at our feet, and I felt, for the briefest fraction of a second, something unfamiliar press against my otherwise orderly thoughts, a sense that the sound was not attempting to enter the house, nor to frighten its occupants, but to acknowledge something already inside. And when Hastings whispered, "Poirot, it chooses, does it not?" I did not answer him immediately, for my attention had shifted to the door once more, where in the faint sheen of candlelight I noticed 3 small indentations in the wood that had not been visible before, shallow but precise, as though pressed from within rather than struck from without, and I realized then, with a clarity that tightened my breath, that if the pattern had advanced from the street, to the door, to the walls, then tonight it had reached the room itself, and the clock's pendulum swung once more, steady and indifferent, and though no further knock came, I understood something far more disturbing than repetition. Whatever marked the hour of 3:17 did not arrive from outside the house at all. It was already here, patient, disciplined, and counting, and as Hastings bent to confirm the doctor's pulse, the clock began its quiet climb toward the next minute, and I found myself wondering, not who would be next, but whether the counting had ever truly begun at 7. Chapter 2. The pattern emerges. When we returned to my study, I closed the door with deliberate care, though I could not have said why, for nothing followed us through the street save the thinning fog. Yet the room did not feel entirely as I had left it, the fire reduced to a low orange pulse, and the air faintly disturbed, as though someone had paced there in our absence. And Hastings immediately began recounting the numbers again, not loudly, but with the mechanical insistence of a man reciting a prayer he no longer believes. "Will protect him, 7 deaths, 12 years, always the same minute, always 3, while I arranged the case files across my desk in chronological order, their edges forming a precise line that appealed to my sense of symmetry. Yet the symmetry itself soon betrayed us, for when I placed a map beneath them and marked each address in red ink, the pattern did not scatter randomly across London as tragedy often does. It curved, gently at first, then with increasing discipline, forming a tightening arc that bent unmistakably toward a single district. And Hastings leaned closer, his breath uneven. "That is not chance." And I agreed, though I felt no satisfaction in the confirmation, because chance wanders, but this had traveled with intention, each death occurring nearer than the last to the widow's residence until tonight, when the spiral had nearly completed its turn. And as I traced the red line inward, I observed something the police reports had overlooked. None of the victims shared a common trade or social circle. Yet each had crossed paths with one particular individual at some minor point in the past decade. A fleeting encounter noted in margins and then forgotten, and Hastings followed my gaze slowly until his expression altered. "Poirot, surely you do not suggest." But I silenced him with a raised hand, for I was still calculating, still resisting the implication. And then another irregularity emerged, subtle but exact. The intervals between deaths were not constant. They were shortening, each gap reduced by 3 days from the previous one, so gradual that no one had perceived the compression, yet undeniable once measured, and Hastings' voice dropped to a whisper. "Then the next will be sooner than expected," and as he spoke, the grandfather clock behind us emitted a sound slightly louder than before. Not the chime, not the strike, but the tick itself, heavy and resonant, as though the pendulum had gained weight, and I turned toward it slowly, noticing for the first time a fine hairline crack in the glass that shielded the face. A crack shaped disturbingly like 3 parallel lines, and though I told myself it was coincidence, my gaze lingered longer than it should have. And when I returned to the desk, my attention fell upon a final inconsistency. Every victim had reported hearing the knocks only once prior to their death, except the widow, who claimed 3 consecutive nights of the sound, and yet remained alive. And that deviation unsettled me far more than the elegance of the spiral, because a pattern that tolerates an exception is not flawed. It is evolving, and Hastings shifted uneasily when I murmured, almost to myself, "Perhaps the sound is not summoning the end. Perhaps it is measuring resistance." And lightning flared outside, illuminating the red convergence on the map in a stark white flash that erased shadow for a heartbeat. And in that merciless clarity, the lines did not merely approach the widow's home. They passed it, continued inward, and terminated precisely at the square in which my own residence stood marked, and I felt, not fear, but an unfamiliar pause in my thoughts. A fraction of hesitation I had not experienced in many years, because every name in those files bore some minor, forgettable connection to me. A shared train carriage, a consultation requested and declined, a dinner invitation politely refused, threads too thin to notice alone, yet undeniable when woven together. And before I could give that realization form, 3 faint taps sounded within the study, so soft they might have been mistaken for wood contracting in the cold, yet spaced with such deliberate equality that neither Hastings nor I moved for several seconds afterward. And he finally spoke, barely audible. "It has followed," and I did not correct him, for my attention had shifted not to the door, nor to the walls, but to the desk itself, where one of the files, closed moments before, now lay slightly ajar, its top page exposed just enough to reveal a line of handwriting I did not recognize, and though I could not yet read the full sentence, 3 words were visible in the margin, written in ink far fresher than the decade-old reported annotated. "You are next," and the clock behind us ticked once more, steady and patient. And I understood then that the spiral had never been narrowing toward the widow at all, It had been drawing inward toward the investigator from the very beginning, not as prey, but as its final proof. And if the compression of days continued as calculated, then 317 would arrive again with far less distance between now and its appointed moment. And this time the knock would not test a door across the street, nor a wall in some distant house, but the certainty upon which I had built my entire life. Chapter 3. The Suspect Confesses. The interrogation room smelled faintly of dust and overheated wiring, the single hanging lamp casting a narrow circle of light upon the table where the suspect sat with his hands folded loosely, not restrained, not restless, simply placed there as though he had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask the correct question. And what unsettled me was not defiance, nor agitation, but the peculiar calm that rested upon him, a calm too complete for a man accused of stalking death across 12 years. And Hastings shifted beside me, lowering his voice. He does not look afraid. And he was correct. There was no tremor in the fingers, no dryness at the lips, no flicker in the eyes when I spoke his name, and I began not with accusation, but with precision. "You visited each residence before the hour in question," I said evenly. "You knocked 3 times. At 3:17. This you admit." And he nodded once, without hesitation. Yes, his voice neither proud nor ashamed, merely factual. And when I asked why, he did not answer immediately but instead glanced toward the wall behind me, listening to something I could not yet hear. And then he said quietly, "Because it was already happening." And Hastings stiffened. "You expect us to believe that?" But the man did not argue. He simply continued, "The first time I heard it, I thought it was meant for my house. 3 knocks. Slow. I waited for someone to open the door. No one did. My daughter died 5 minutes later." And his jaw tightened briefly, not theatrically, but with memory, and I observed carefully, searching for fabrication, yet grief leaves a residue that is difficult to counterfeit. And when I pressed him, "The first recorded incident predates your daughter's death by 2 years, he blinked once, as if adjusting a calculation he had believed accurate, and murmured, almost to himself, "Then I was not the first to hear it." And that statement altered the air in the room more than any confession could have, because it suggested not authorship, but inheritance, and I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "You began repeating the knock after her death." And he nodded. "I thought if I echoed it, if I made it deliberate, I could get ahead of it." And Hastings frowned. "Get ahead of what?" And the suspect's gaze settled finally on mine, steady and unblinking. "Of the second hand," he said, and as though summoned by the word, the clock in the corridor outside emitted a dull tick that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a brief moment no one spoke, the silence stretching thin, until I asked carefully, "You claim you did not kill them?" And he answered without emphasis, "I knocked. I never stayed to watch." And that detail struck me harder than denial would have, because it aligned with the reports. Each victim had been alone when they collapsed, and before I could pursue the inconsistency further, the overhead lamp flickered once, sharply, not fading but snapping off and on in a fraction of darkness that felt longer than it was, and in that instant, between light and restoration, 3 soft taps sounded, not beneath the table as one might expect, but directly above us, from the ceiling, measured and evenly spaced, as though knuckles had pressed against the floor of the room above in patient acknowledgement. And Hastings jerked upward, eyes wide. Yet the suspect did not move. He merely closed his eyes briefly, as one does upon hearing a familiar refrain, and when the lights steadied again, I became aware of something far more disturbing than the sound itself. My own pulse had synchronized with the rhythm of those taps. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, a pause, and I forced myself to breathe deliberately to disrupt it, to reclaim internal order, and I asked, more quietly now, "You said you tried to get ahead of it. How?" And he gave the faintest shake of his head. "You cannot outrun something that has already marked the minute." And Hastings stepped back from the table entirely, but I remained seated, studying the suspect's expression not for madness but for relief. And there it was, not triumph, not hysteria, but release, as though being questioned had ended a burden rather than imposed one. And in that moment I understood something with chilling clarity. This man had not engineered the deaths. He had been attempting to intervene in them, to imitate the sound in hopes of breaking its sequence. Yet every time he knocked, someone died anyway. And if the pattern had persisted despite his interference, then the mechanism driving it was indifferent to human imitation. And as the corridor clock began its slow approach toward another minute, I noticed faint dust drifting from the ceiling directly above the suspect's head. 3 thin lines settling upon the table in parallel streaks, and though no further sound followed, I felt the structure of the case shift beneath my feet. Because if he had only been echoing what he heard, then the original source had never sat across from me in this room at all. And as I rose at last, the suspect opened his eyes and said softly, almost apologetically, "You will hear it too, properly, next time." And I did not ask him what he meant, for I had already begun to suspect that when 317 arrived again, the knock would not test the walls for weakness, it would test whether the rhythm had already taken hold within me. Chapter 4. The Crack in Time. The newspaper archive felt less like a room and more like a mausoleum for unfinished explanations, the air thick with paper rot and the faint metallic scent of aging ink. And as Hastings pulled a brittle volume from a shelf marked 1911, a quiet understanding settled upon me that we were no longer investigating a recent anomaly. We were trespassing upon something that had been proceeding uninterrupted long before either of us had drawn breath. And when I unfolded the front page describing a sudden collapse preceded by 3 deliberate knocks at precisely 3:17 in the morning, I felt not surprise but displacement, because the phrasing was identical to the widow's account, not similar, identical, down to the peculiar emphasis on the word deliberate, and Hastings noticed it too, tracing the sentence with his finger, whispering. Even the pause between the knocks is described the same way, and I turned the page carefully, revealing a marginal note pinned by a forgotten inspector whose name had long since faded. The knocking does not begin at 3:17. It ends there, and that reversal altered the architecture of the case more than any confession could have, for it suggested that what we had been measuring as origin was in fact conclusion. And if 3:17 marked the end of something unseen, then the true sequence occurred in silence beforehand, unnoticed and unrecorded, and Hastings stepped back as thunder rolled above the archive roof. "So everything we've charted is only the final minute?" And I did not answer, because another clipping from 1893 had caught my attention. Again the same hour, again the same 3 knocks. Yet this witness described the sound not at the door, but from within the walls themselves, as though the structure had produced it. And as I aligned the dates across the wooden table, a rhythm emerged not in years, but in spacing. 33 years between early incidents, then 21, then 12, and finally mere months in the present cycle, the intervals tightening with quiet discipline, and Hastings noticed the convergence without my prompting. "It's accelerating," he said softly, and I nodded once, though my attention had shifted to the clock mounted above the archive doorway, whose second hand appeared strangely hesitant, ticking not smoothly, but with the faintest stutter, as though meeting resistance at each mark. And when I withdrew my pocket watch to compare, I observed something equally unsettling. It was not stopped, but slow, lagging behind by nearly a full minute, though I had wound it that afternoon, and Hastings checked his own and found the same discrepancy, not frozen, not broken, merely delayed. And the realization settled quietly between us that whatever culminated at 3:17 did not require the suspension of time. It required its compression, and as the minute hand of the archive clock crept toward that familiar position, the air in the room seemed to narrow, not dramatically, not visibly, but perceptibly, the silence between ticks elongating just enough to be noticed. And then, without warning, a single knock resonated through the wooden table beneath our hands. Not loud, not violent, but deep enough to vibrate the clippings ever so slightly, and Hastings recoiled. Yet I kept my palms flat against the surface, counting internally, and the second knock followed after an interval marginally shorter than expected, and the third shorter still, the spacing subtly altered, not matching the established rhythm we had come to anticipate. And that deviation disturbed me far more than repetition ever had, because repetition implies stability, but alteration implies awareness. And when the archive clock finally reached 3:17, it did not chime. Instead, its second hand snapped forward abruptly as though catching up to lost time, producing a sharp metallic click that echoed disproportionately in the confined space. And in that instant I noticed something small yet irrevocable. The clipping from 1893, which had moments before borne only the faded ink of its era, now displayed 3 faint indentations along its margin, impressions not visible when we first unfolded it. Shallow but precise, as though the paper itself had been tapped from the other side. And Hastings saw them too, his voice unsteady. Those weren't there. And he was correct. They had not been. And I felt then not the sensation of being watched, but of being integrated, as though by aligning the dates and exposing the contraction of decades into days, we had not disrupted the sequence but completed a calculation it had long been approaching. And when I glanced once more at the marginal note, the knocking does not begin at 3:17. It ends there. I understood its full implication. The visible sound was the closing mark of something already finished, and if the intervals were shortening so dramatically in our era, then the unseen portion preceding 3:17 must now be unfolding more rapidly than ever before. And as Hastings gathered the clippings with shaking hands, I remained still, because the most disturbing detail had only just occurred to me. Not that the pattern had accelerated when we uncovered it, but that the earliest documented investigator in 1893 had reportedly heard the knocking personally before dying the following night. And the spacing between his discovery and his death had been exactly 1 day. And as I calculated the compression from 33 years to 12, from 12 to months, from months to days, I realized with cold precision that the sequence had never been generational at all. It had simply been waiting for someone to measure it correctly. And now that we had done so, the remaining interval would not be counted in years, nor in months, but in hours. Chapter 5. The final unanswered knock. The study felt altered, though nothing in its arrangement had changed. The same shelves, the same fire reduced to embers, the same clock mounted above the mantel. Yet the air seemed denser, as though the room had absorbed too much understanding in a single night, and Hastings stood rigid beside the fireplace, his earlier agitation replaced by a strained silence that unsettled me more than questions would have. For men speak when they still believe explanation is possible, and the files upon my desk no longer appeared scattered but aligned with uncomfortable precision. The clippings from 1893 through the present forming not a spiral nor a contraction, but a succession, and when placed in proper order, they revealed something far less abstract than a generational anomaly. They revealed a sequence of hands, each investigator documenting the pattern, each report followed within months by a sudden, unanticipated death, and then, without announcement, the phenomenon resurfacing elsewhere, under new scrutiny. And Hastings' voice was thin when he said, "It cannot simply pass from man to man." And I replied quietly, "It does not pass, it settles." Because the earliest marginal notes we uncovered had not described fear nor pursuit, but recognition, and recognition carries weight. And as the clock began its patient climb toward 3:17 once more, I asked him, very softly, "When did you first hear it, Hastings?" And he hesitated. Too long. And I watched memory surface behind his eyes, the recollection of waking 2 nights before the widow's final hour to 3 indistinct taps against his bedroom wall, dismissed at the time as settling pipes, yet now impossible to ignore, and his breath shortened as understanding dawned, not dramatic, not explosive, but gradual and suffocating. And I observed then what I had been reluctant to acknowledge. In each archived account, the investigator had reported a single personal encounter with the knocking prior to documenting the case formally, just once, and within the year the pattern relocated, leaving behind a corpse and a final report, and the cost of awareness was not immediate. It was delayed, patient, measured, and as that realization settled between us, the second hand of the clock reached its appointed mark, and 3:17 arrived not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with stillness, and for a moment there was nothing at all, no sound, no movement, until 3 soft taps emerged against the glass of the clock face, from within, each one precise enough to tremble the reflection of the room, without disturbing the mechanism itself. And Hastings stepped back as though struck, but I remained seated, my gaze fixed upon my own faint image in the glass, and for the first time since this began, I allowed a silence to remain unbroken, because the implication required no articulation. And when the 3rd tap faded, the clock resumed its ordinary ticking as though nothing had occurred. Yet something subtle had shifted. Hastings' posture no longer mirrored mine, his earlier agitation replaced by a distant focus, his eyes lingering upon the clock with an attention that was no longer analytical but attentive, listening for what might come next, and I realized then that succession does not announce itself with ceremony. It manifests in attention, in the quiet transfer of vigilance from one mind to another, and, as I lowered my gaze to the desk, I noticed 3 faint impressions in the polished wood where my fingertips had rested during the final strike. Indentations not present before, shallow but exact, and though I had not felt my hand move, the alignment was undeniable, and Hastings, after a long moment, spoke in a voice that did not quite belong to the man who had entered the study hours earlier. "It does not end, does it?" And I considered answering him, offering reassurance or denial. But neither would have been honest, and so I did something I have rarely done in my career. I allowed the question to stand unanswered, and outside, beyond the darkened window, the night carried on with indifferent calm, no storm, no spectacle, only the steady progression of minutes. And somewhere within that progression, unnoticed and unremarked, the responsibility for listening had shifted ever so slightly away from me. Thank you for visiting Old Lantern Tales. The stories don't end here. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a secret from the shadows. Until next time, keep your lanterns burning.